Final snapshot of what you learned. Chapter 14 has walked you through the major contract tools used to actually transfer real estate, one step at a time. By now, you can see that conveyance is not just about a deed. It is about the entire legal pathway, from first offer to final recording. Each contract form you studied is simply a different way of organizing rights, risk, timing, and money between the parties. You began with the traditional contract for the sale of real estate. This is the core, everyday instrument in residential practice. You learned that the sale contract is a binding, executory agreement where a buyer agrees to purchase and a seller agrees to sell a specific property on agreed terms. The contract sits in the middle of the transaction timeline. First, the parties negotiate and exchange offers and counteroffers. Then, once there is full offer and acceptance, the agreement becomes an executory contract during the pre-closing period, while inspections, financing, title work, and escrow tasks are completed. Finally, at closing, the seller delivers the deed, the buyer delivers the funds, and the sale contract has been fully performed and essentially disappears. You then focused on the legal characteristics that make a sale contract enforceable. You revisited the familiar elements of offer, acceptance, consideration, capacity, and lawful purpose, but now applied directly to real estate. You saw that a real estate sale contract must be in writing, must clearly identify the parties and the property, state a definite purchase price, and be signed by the parties who are bound. You explored the difference between legal and equitable title and saw that once a valid sale contract is in place, the buyer gains equitable title. This equitable interest gives the buyer powerful remedies, such as the right to seek specific performance if the seller refuses to deed the property after the buyer has performed. The chapter also reinforced how offers, counteroffers, delivery, earnest money, and contingencies actually work in practice. Through the James and Fred example, you watched how each new offer or counteroffer cancels the previous one, how nothing is binding until the ratified contract is delivered, and how earnest money and contingencies protect both parties. Contingencies such as financing, appraisal, home inspection, and sale of the buyer's current home are not just theory. They are the specific, written escape hatches that allow a contract to be canceled without default when clearly described and properly used. You then move deeper into the anatomy of the sale contract by examining its provisions. You learned that the boilerplate is not just filler. Provisions about parties, consideration, legal description, price and terms, loan approval, earnest money, escrow, closing and possession, type of deed, title evidence, and closing costs all allocate risk and responsibility. You saw how residential seller property disclosure statements and similar forms tie into the contract and give the buyer important information about property condition while creating liability if material defects are concealed. You also looked at secondary provisions that can become very important in specific transactions, such as association disclosures, environmental hazards, due on sale awareness, rental and tenant rights, tax-deferred exchanges, flood information, and foreign seller withholding. From there, the chapter broadened your toolkit with special contract types that adjust the timing and nature of rights in more creative ways. The option to buy contract is a classic unilateral agreement. The seller, or option or, agrees to sell on specific terms within a specific time, if and only if the optionee chooses to exercise the option. The optionee pays separate consideration for this right. Until exercise, the optionee is not obligated to buy, but the seller is obligated to sell if the option is properly exercised. You saw how options can be used by buyers who need time to raise funds, investigate feasibility, or plan development while preventing the property from being sold to someone else. You also learned that to be enforceable, options need real consideration, clear price and terms, a definite expiration date, a legal description, and the usual elements of contract validity. The chapter also highlighted related concepts such as lease options, options in commercial development, and rights of first refusal. You learn that a right of first refusal is different from an option. It does not give the holder the immediate power to buy at any time. Instead, it gives them the first chance to purchase if and when the owner decides to sell, often on terms presented by a third party's offer. You saw how these clauses are used between landlords and tenants, family members, homeowners associations, and even in mobile home parks, where the park has the first right to purchase a home to prevent it from being moved. Finally, you explored the contract for deed, also known as a land contract, installment sale, conditional sales contract, agreement for deed, or in Arizona practice, an agreement for sale. Here, the seller finances the buyer's purchase directly. The vendee takes possession and gains equitable title, but the vendor keeps legal title until the buyer has made all required payments. You saw how this structure can open the door to ownership for buyers who cannot qualify for conventional financing, while also creating tax planning opportunities for sellers who wish to spread capital gains over several years. At the same time, you analyze the risks. For vendors, the buyer may take possession with a small down payment and then neglect or damage the property, or default and walk away. For vendees, the vendor still holds legal title and can encumber the property or default on an underlying mortgage, putting the buyer's equity at risk. You also examined how default and forfeiture provisions can be harsh if strictly enforced, and how many courts now lean toward foreclosure, like protections, or cure opportunities when the buyer has built substantial equity. Throughout the chapter, an important theme repeated itself. Real estate contracts are not just forms to fill out. They are legally binding roadmaps that control money, time, possession, risk, remedies, and title. Whether the instrument is a basic sale contract, an option to buy, a right of first refusal, or a contract for deed, your job as a real estate professional is to understand what rights each party is gaining and giving up, how those rights are triggered, and what happens if things do not go as planned. Review summary. In this chapter, you learned that a real estate sale contract is the central instrument of a traditional sale, and that it must be valid, written, signed, and sufficiently definite to be enforceable. You reinforced your understanding of offers, counteroffers, acceptance, delivery, earnest money, contingencies, and equitable title. You examined major sale contract provisions, including parties and consideration, legal description, price and terms, financing and loan approval, escrow, closing and possession, deeds, title evidence, closing costs, disclosures, and seller and agent responsibilities. You then studied the option to buy as a unilateral contract that becomes bilateral once exercised. You learned the required elements of a valid option, common provisions such as notice, forfeiture, title warranties, and crediting of option consideration, and practical uses like development feasibility, lease options, and investment strategies. You also distinguished options from rights of first refusal and saw how those clauses function in leases, family arrangements, associations, and mobile home parks. You concluded with the contract for deed, where the vendor finances the transaction and retains legal title until the vendee completes installment payments. You learned about the rights and obligations of vendor and vendee, typical payment structures, including balloon payments, the significance of recording the contract, and how default and forfeiture are handled under traditional and modern approaches. You finished with practical guidelines for reducing risk by using proper forms, legal advice, escrow, title services, and a clear understanding of state law. Discussion. How does equitable title help explain the buyer's position after a sale contract is signed but before closing? And why does that matter if the seller tries to back out? Answer. Equitable title means the buyer already has a recognized ownership interest even though legal title has not yet been deeded. Because of this equitable interest, the buyer can often seek specific performance, asking a court to compel the seller to deliver the deed as promised instead of simply accepting a refund or minor damages. Why must an option to buy contain a definite expiration date? And what risk arises if the parties treat an option more like an agreement to agree later? Answer: the expiration date defines the precise period in which the optionee can exercise the right to buy and prevents uncertainty about how long the seller is bound, while the buyer remains free to decide. If key terms and timelines are vague and left to future negotiation, a court may treat the clause as an unenforceable agreement to agree rather than a binding option, leaving the would-be buyer without the remedy of specific performance. When might a contract for deed be a good tool for a buyer and seller? And when might it be dangerous for one or both parties? Answer: it can be useful when the buyer cannot yet qualify for conventional financing, but can reasonably make installment payments, and when the seller is willing to act as lender to make a difficult property more marketable, or to manage tax consequences. It becomes dangerous if the contract includes strict forfeiture with little equity protection, if the vendor is heavily leveraged or unreliable with underlying payments, or if the vendee does not understand the risk of losing both possession and accumulated payments upon default. In the context of Chapter 14, how do you decide which contract structure is appropriate for a given situation? A standard sale contract, an option, a right of first refusal, or a contract for deed? Answer: you decide by analyzing the parties' goals, timing, financing capacity, risk tolerance, and the level of commitment each side is ready to make. A standard sale contract fits when both parties are ready for an immediate commitment and closing. An option fits when a buyer needs time to decide or to investigate feasibility but wants to lock in terms. A right of first refusal fits when someone wants first chance to buy if the property is ever sold. A contract for deed fits when the buyer needs long-term seller financing and the seller is willing to retain title as security until the price is paid. Closing remarks. Chapter 14 has taken you beyond the simple idea that a contract is a contract and shown you how different conveyance contracts shape the entire transaction. As a future broker or salesperson, your value to clients will depend on how well you understand these structures and can explain them in plain language. Always connect each contract choice back to the core elements of validity and enforceability, and always think ahead to what happens if the transaction does not go perfectly. In the real world, contracts are not just paperwork,